December 21st, 1944, Ligneville, Belgium. The cold settled over the Ardennes like a living thing. It crept beneath uniforms, climbed through boots, and clung to breath as it drifted into the darkness. In the small, half-destroyed village of Ligneville, the winter wind whispered through shattered windows and hollowed-out homes, carrying distant thunder from artillery miles away. The sky had not yet admitted dawn, yet faint pulses of orange light flickered on the horizon where shells burst behind a ridgeline. Somewhere in that broken silence, a 19-year-old soldier pressed his body against a collapsed stone parapet, his gloved hands wrapped tightly around the cold tube of a bazooka. Private Daniel Mercer, orphan from upstate New York, crouched low enough that only his helmet peeked above the frost-covered stones. He had survived basic training, survived the long push into Belgium, survived nights so cold they turned water to ice inside canteens. But what approached him now was unlike anything he had ever faced. The first sound came as a tremor, faint, rhythmical, almost like a heartbeat traveling through the earth. Daniel felt it before he heard it. Snow vibrated softly beneath his boots. Loose bricks shifted behind him. Then the sound grew louder. Tank engines, not idling, advancing. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he peeked over the wall. The fog along the road began to stir and split apart, pushed aside by something heavy and relentless. A moment later, the shadow of a tank's turret emerged through the mist. Then another, and a third. 3 SS Panzer IVs, rolling in tight formation, their metal treads crushing the frozen ground. Gray paint streaked with soot, snow caked against the sides, their main guns pointing forward through the morning haze. Behind them, the silhouettes of nearly 40 Waffen-SS infantry fanned into 2 staggered lines, rifles at the ready. Take a second to support the mission of WW2 Frontline Legends. Hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single comment, and your support helps keep forgotten heroes alive. Daniel exhaled slowly. He knew what they were. He knew what they were capable of. And he knew what they had done only 4 days earlier at Malmedy. Every American soldier in the Ardennes knew. The story had spread like wildfire. American prisoners rounded up, forced into a field, and shot. No negotiations, no mercy. Daniel swallowed hard, lowering his head behind the wall. He wasn't afraid to fight, but he understood exactly what being captured meant. And yet, he remained. The rest of Bravo Company had retreated 20 minutes earlier under direct orders. Their captain insisted the bridge wasn't worth dying for. Fall back, regroup, hold secondary positions, he had said. This ground isn't worth one more casualty. But Daniel had heard something over the radio that changed everything. A sudden burst of static had cut through the usual artillery chatter. Then a panicked voice, an American voice, crackled through. Anyone out there, do you copy? Germans approaching the Ligneville crossing. If they break through, the 106th will be cut off, 6,000 men trapped. Repeat, 6,000. The transmission ended abruptly, but the message had already seared itself into Daniel's mind. 6,000 Americans, in the forest, without escape. If the SS captured the bridge, that entire division would be surrounded. He remembered standing there in the snow as Bravo Company retreated, torn between duty and instinct. He remembered watching the line of soldiers move away into the trees until their shapes were swallowed by darkness. He remembered gripping his bazooka, staring down the empty road toward the bridge, and realizing that retreat wasn't an option, not for him. Because sometimes the manuals didn't matter. Sometimes the odds didn't matter. Sometimes a single moment forced a soldier to decide what kind of person he would be. Daniel had made his choice. Now alone in the ruins, he adjusted his helmet, lifted the bazooka to his shoulder, and studied the terrain. The collapsed barn to his left leaned inward, as if it might give way at any moment. The wrecked German half-track behind him sat half-buried in snow, its mounted .50 caliber machine gun frozen in place. To his right, the burned-out shell of a Sherman tank lay partially overturned, its tracks blown off during a fight the day before. Farther along, a destroyed Panzer lay against a broken wall like a discarded toy. For positions, for possible firing angles, all within sprinting distance if he timed it perfectly. A slow plan began forming in his mind, one the army had never taught him. A plan that no manual would ever endorse. If he moved fast, firing from different positions before the Germans adjusted, if he used the environment, the ruins, and the wrecks, if he could confuse them long enough, he might be able to make the enemy believe they were facing something far more dangerous than a single private with 4 rockets. He braced himself to stand, but something made him freeze. A faint sound behind him, a soft shifting beneath broken lumber. Daniel's breath hitched. He turned his head a fraction, careful not to draw attention. Through a jagged gap in the wall, he could just make out the edge of the collapsed barn. Its doorway hung crooked, snow piled high along the threshold. But something inside moved, slowly, subtly. A shadow. Daniel tightened his grip on the bazooka. Bravo Company had retreated. No one should be here. Not a single American. Could it be a civilian, a wounded soldier, or a German scout who slipped behind the lines? He crouched lower, listening. The tanks rumbled closer, the sound swelling until it filled every corner of the ruined village. Snow fell from rooftops with each vibration. Window panes rattled. Loose stones tumbled down broken walls. Daniel forced himself to ignore the movement inside the barn. At least for now. He had seconds left before the first tank reached bazooka range. Seconds before the infantry fanned out and spotted him. Seconds before hesitation became death. He exhaled, pressing a rocket into the launching tube. Metal clicked. Snowflakes drifted lazily in the air, catching glints of orange from distant explosions. His heartbeat settled into a steady rhythm as the world around him narrowed until only the tank remained in focus. The lead panzer crawled forward, its tracks squealing, its turret rotating, its machine gun scanning the shadows. Daniel inhaled deeply and prepared to fire. That was when the German radio chatter reached him again. Closer now, clearer, sharp with urgency. He didn't understand every word, but one phrase repeated over and over. Amerikanischer Offizier. Finden. Find the American officer. Find him. Daniel's brows pulled together. Why would 3 tanks and 40 infantry be sent to capture a single officer? Why this road? Why this village? Why now, when the forest battles raged to the east? He didn't have answers. All he had were questions. Questions that pressed against his mind as heavily as the cold wind pressed against his cheeks. The tanks continued their approach. The infantry scanned the ruins. And Daniel, alone behind the broken stone wall, realized something unsettling. He might not be the only American left in Ligniville. He steadied the bazooka, lining up the shot. His muscles tensed. The fog parted around the lead panzer, giving him a perfect angle. He whispered to himself, "You only get one life. Make it count." He was moments from pulling the trigger, but behind him, inside the barn, the shadow shifted again. This time, unmistakably, someone was in there. Someone Daniel had not expected. Someone the Germans might be hunting. The tanks rolled forward, closing in. The abandoned village held its breath. And Daniel Mercer, one orphan boy with 4 rockets and no backup, prepared to begin a battle he had no guarantee of surviving. Before the first shot is fired, before the impossible truly begins, take a moment to support the mission of WW2 Frontline Legends. If stories like this mean something to you, please hit subscribe, tap like, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Your comments help keep forgotten heroes alive. Daniel tightened his stance. The first tank was in perfect range. He would fire. He would move. He would run faster than Dr. Loud. He would become a shifting ghost across the ruins, a phantom defender the Germans couldn't track. He just didn't yet know that someone in the collapsed barn was about to change everything. The first rocket left the bazooka with a sharp burst of smoke and fire, slicing through the icy air with a streak that cut the fog in half. The lead SS Panzer never saw it coming. The projectile struck just beneath the turret ring, one of the few vulnerabilities in its armored shell. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the tank lurched violently. A plume of smoke rose from the impact point. The turret froze mid-rotation. The massive machine ground to a halt in the snow, steam hissing from its damaged interior. German infantry scrambled for cover, shouting orders that echoed through the ruined village. Daniel didn't stay to watch. He was already moving. The moment the rocket left the tube, he dropped the bazooka, swung the empty launcher across his back, and sprinted toward the collapsed barn. Machine gun fire erupted behind him as the second tank opened fire on the stone wall he'd been hiding behind. Chunks of debris exploded upward. Snow and broken stone rained across the road. Daniel dove through the crooked wooden doorway of the barn, rolled across the frozen dirt floor, and landed behind a stack of shattered beams. His breathing came in hot bursts against the cold, fogging the air. He wasn't alone. A soft groan came from the corner, barely audible under the tank engines. Daniel froze, eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The barn roof had partially collapsed overnight, leaving jagged gaps where snow filtered in like drifting ash. Shadows pooled in the corners, deep and unmoving. Then the shadow moved. Daniel tightened the grip on his weapon and inched forward, boots silent against the brittle ground. Someone was lying there, half buried beneath a fallen beam, wrapped in a torn American winter jacket smeared with dirt and soot. Daniel's heart jolted. The face, pale, weak, but unmistakably alive, belonged to Corporal Everett Shaw, a signal specialist from Bravo Company, who everyone believed had been killed during the previous night's shelling. Shaw's eyes flickered open, cloudy with pain, but still aware. He stared at Daniel as if unsure whether he was seeing a ghost or becoming one. Daniel dropped to his knees beside him. "Shaw, can you hear me?" The corporal swallowed, his breath shallow, his voice little more than a whisper. "You stayed." "I didn't have a choice," Daniel said softly. "They're coming right for the bridge." Shaw struggled to speak, each word seeming to cost him effort. "They're not after the bridge." Daniel frowned. Outside, the second Panzer rumbled into position, its turrets sweeping the village like an eye searching for movement. German infantry took cover behind rubble, aiming rifles toward the barn. Daniel ducked instinctively. "What do you mean?" he whispered. Shaw's voice trembled. "They're hunting an officer." The words hung in the air like frost. Daniel's breath caught. "What officer?" Shaw closed his eyes briefly, then forced them open again. "Not a commander, a cryptographer." A cryptographer. Daniel felt a chill run deeper than cold. Why would the SS move 3 tanks and 40 infantry just to find one cryptographer? Unless that cryptographer carried something more dangerous than any weapon. Something the Germans desperately wanted. Daniel's pulse quickened. "Is he here? In Lignaville?" Shaw's lips moved. But another explosion thundered just outside the barn as a German shell detonated against a wall opposite the bridge. Dust rained from rafters. Daniel shielded Shaw with his body as the debris settled. When the sound faded, Shaw finally managed to whisper, "They already caught him." Daniel froze. Last night, during the confusion, civilian clothes, they pulled him out of a basement, didn't know who he was at first. Daniel's mind raced. If the SS realized the man they'd captured was carrying critical Allied encryption keys or codes, the consequences for American units across the Ardennes could be catastrophic. He leaned closer. "Shaw, what did they take from him?" Shaw's breathing quickened, painful and strained. A leather case sealed he never let out of his hands. Daniel didn't need more explanation. A cryptographer's case could contain cipher wheels, code books, authentication tables, materials that could allow enemy forces to intercept, decode, or mimic American communications. Losing it could expose entire divisions. It could shift the momentum of the German offensive. Outside, the second Panzer repositioned, its turret pointed directly at the barn. Daniel ducked back into cover. "They think he's still here. That's why they advanced." Shaw nodded faintly. "They didn't find what they were looking for. They think someone hid it. Someone stayed behind." Daniel's blood ran cold. "They think I have it," he realized. The tanks weren't advancing to destroy the bridge. They were advancing to eliminate or capture whoever remained in Lignaville, someone they believed held the cryptographer's case. Daniel glanced at Shaw. "Did you hide it?" Shaw's eyes darkened. "No, I never saw it after they took him." Daniel clenched his jaw. That meant the Germans might not have the case, and they were desperate to retrieve it before the officer could be moved or the codes changed. He shifted closer as Shaw's breathing weakened. "Can you walk?" Shaw shook his head slightly. "Doesn't matter, you need to get out." You need to. Daniel grabbed his hand. I'm not leaving you. Shaw's grip tightened weakly. You don't understand, they're coming back. Not just infantry, more tanks, reinforcements. Another explosion ripped across the road. Daniel turned instinctively as a shell slammed into the half-track, throwing sparks and metal fragments into the snow. He had seconds to act. He looked back at Shaw. Listen to me. I'm going to draw their fire away from this barn. If you stay quiet, they might pass over you. Shaw's expression twisted. Not fear, but frustration. The helpless frustration of a soldier unable to rise. Daniel, whatever you do, don't let them cross that bridge. Don't let them find anything. Daniel nodded, though the fear in Shaw's voice lingered like smoke. Then he heard the sound that set the next stage of the fight in motion. A tank commander shouting orders in German, followed by the grinding shift of gears. The 2nd Panzer advanced toward the bridge. If it crossed, the village and everything beyond would be lost. Daniel slung the bazooka back over his shoulder and rose to crouch. Stay down, Shaw. I'll be back. Shaw exhaled shakily. Be careful. Daniel offered a faint, tired smile. I'll try. He turned toward the ruined doorway. Outside, the world had become chaos. The disabled 1st Panzer spewed smoke. The 2nd tank crept forward, scanning for new targets. Infantry dove between cover positions. Machine gun bursts cracked through the air. Daniel sprinted toward the half-track. Bullets struck the snow behind him, kicking up white plumes. The frozen ground blurred beneath his boots. His lungs burned with the cold as he dove behind the half-track steel frame just as another burst of fire ripped across the road. The .50 caliber machine gun mounted atop the half-track sat stiff with frost. But Daniel grabbed the charging handle and fought it until it finally jerked backward. The weapon clacked into readiness. He braced his shoulder against the frozen metal and squeezed the trigger. The roar of the .50 cal exploded across the village, a deep, bone-shaking thunder. Tracer rounds streaked through the air, forcing German infantry to scatter. The Panzer's turret snapped toward him, searching for the source of the heavy fire. From the barn, Shaw could hear the chaos, the thunder, the shouting. He could only pray that Daniel's movement was fast enough to confuse the enemy. And Daniel knew he had to keep moving. He had to be everywhere. He had to be nowhere. He had to become an entire platoon. German soldiers shouted to one another. Mareri positionen, Mareri Amerikaner. Multiple positions, multiple Americans. That was the illusion. Daniel released the trigger, letting the barrel cool for a second. His breath came in desperate bursts. The 2nd tank adjusted, preparing to fire. He swung down from the half-track and sprinted toward the ruined Panzer lying on its side near the east wall. His boots slipped on ice. A bullet grazed his sleeve. Snow exploded to his left. But he made it behind the wreck just as the 2nd Panzer fired a shell that obliterated the half-track he'd just been sitting behind. Daniel leaned against the metal of the destroyed tank, panting, eyes burning from smoke. The ground trembled under the pressure of the advancing armor. He reached into the wreck, searching desperately, and found what he needed. 2 German anti-tank grenades. Snowflakes drifted across his gloves as he lifted them, the cold stinging his fingers. He stared at the grenades, then at the advancing Panzer, and understood there was only one move left, one that every manual would call reckless, suicidal. Impossible, but impossible was the only option he had left. Daniel Mercer tightened his grip, rose from behind the wreck, and prepared to charge. He didn't know if Shaw would survive. He didn't know if the officer captured miles away was still alive, and he didn't know if any reinforcements would ever reach him. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. If the SS crossed that bridge, thousands would be lost. He stepped into the open snow and ran straight toward the Panzer. Snow kicked up beneath Daniel's boots as he sprinted across the open ground, the freezing air cutting against his lungs like broken glass. The 3rd SS Panzer loomed ahead of him, its engine growling like some mechanical predator preparing to strike. The tank commander spotted him first. A sharp command burst from the turret, and the machine gun mounted on top swung toward the lone American charging through the snow. The first burst of gunfire tore across the frozen ground inches behind Daniel. Tracer rounds snapped past him, glowing red through the fog. But he didn't slow. He didn't dive. He didn't attempt to dodge. There was no time. No cover left. No second chance. He ran straight at the panzer. The German infantry shouted in disbelief. From their perspective, no sane soldier would make such a charge. A small group might attempt it. Maybe a squad with grenades and covering fire. But one man, alone, charging a tank head-on? They had never seen it. For a split second, even the machine gunner hesitated, stunned by the sight. And in that moment of hesitation, Daniel reached the 20-meter mark, then 15, then 10. He pulled the first anti-tank grenade from his jacket, yanked the pin with trembling fingers, and hurled it toward the Panzer's right track. The grenade struck the treads, bounced once, rolled beneath the wheels, and detonated with a muffled metallic crack. The Panzer lurched violently to the right, its track shuddering as several of the wheels jammed. Steam and smoke spilled out from beneath the armor as the engine strained to compensate. The tank skidded sideways, lost traction, and ground to a halt, stuck at an awkward angle in the snow. Daniel dove behind a pile of rubble just as another burst of machine gun fire shredded the air above him. He hit the ground hard. Pain shot through his left shoulder. He clenched his teeth and looked up just in time to see the Panzer's turret rotating toward him. The cannon angled down slightly, aiming for the rubble pile where he had landed. He knew he couldn't stay there. He had seconds. Daniel pushed himself upright and sprinted again, weaving between broken walls and collapsed beams. Bullets clattered against stone behind him. Chunks of mortar exploded outward. The Germans were furious now, convinced they were fighting not one soldier, but a desperate, well-coordinated defensive force. Daniel reached another position, the burned-out Sherman tank lying on its side, and dropped behind its ruined hull. He heard German radio chatter through the tank's thin armor. Mehrere Teams mindestens Einzug schwer Widerstand. Multiple teams. At least a platoon. Heavy resistance. Daniel wiped the sweat and snow from his eyes. They really believed it. His breathing steadied. His thoughts sharpened. He looked back across the village toward the barn where Shaw lay hidden. If the Germans called in reinforcements, as Shaw had warned, there would be more tanks, more infantry, more firepower than he could ever face alone. He tightened his grip on the second grenade. This wasn't over. It was only beginning. The immobilized third tank groaned as its crew attempted to rotate the turret, unaware of the danger creeping toward them. Daniel rolled from behind the Sherman and dashed toward the Panzer's rear. Every muscle screamed. Every breath burned. He could barely feel his fingers. But he kept running. At close range, the tank's machine gun couldn't depress far enough to hit him. Daniel hugged the ground, moving in tight arcs around the vehicle. He reached its rear engine panel, gears whining loudly inside the armor. He primed the second grenade, pulled back, and threw. The metallic clink of the grenade striking the engine grate echoed through the frozen air. Daniel turned and sprinted away. Behind him, the grenade detonated, not with fire but with a sharp punch of concussive force that buckled the Panzer's rear structure. Smoke poured from the vents. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The third SS tank was out of the fight. German infantry faltered. Confusion spread. They began shouting over one another, shouting at shadows that were never really there, shouting at ruins and burning vehicles, as if expecting new defenders to reveal themselves at any moment. Daniel staggered behind a low stone barrier, chest heaving, vision swimming from exhaustion. 20 minutes. Barely 20 minutes had passed since the first shot. 3 SS tanks were disabled or destroyed. Infantry scattered. German coordination broken. And one lone soldier had convinced them they were up against an entire American defensive force. But he wasn't finished. Daniel listened as frantic German radio chatter intensified. They were calling for reinforcements, calling for artillery support, calling for armored recovery crews. They were afraid to advance. They believed the ruins were crawling with American soldiers. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. He knew the truth. He was the only one left. He forced himself upright and scanned the village. Smoke curled from the tanks. Snow drifted through the air. The battlefield had fallen eerily quiet, too quiet. The Germans were pulling back. Not a full retreat. Not yet. But they weren't advancing either. They were regrouping. They were reassessing. and the silence hanging over the ruins felt more dangerous than the chaos that had come before. Daniel moved back toward the barn, weaving through the rubble. The snow crunched softly beneath his boots. His breath fogged the air in front of him. He slipped inside. Shaw was still alive, but barely. His face was pale, his breath thin. Daniel knelt beside him. The tanks pulled back. "You're safe for now." Shaw weakly shook his head. "No, you don't understand. They're searching for someone. They'll be back. They're not done." Daniel swallowed. "The officer. The cryptographer. You said they captured him." Shaw nodded slowly. They didn't know who he was at first, but once they searched him, they realized he carried something important. Daniel felt a quiet dread rise through him. "The case?" he asked softly. Shaw coughed, nodding again. "If they break it open, they could unlock everything." Daniel looked toward the road where the Germans had withdrawn. He understood now. The tanks had come to clear the village. The infantry had come to search every ruin. The reinforcements they called were coming to sweep the entire area. Not for Daniel, not for Bravo Company, not even for the bridge. They were coming for the cryptographer's case. And the officer who carried it was already in German hands. Daniel pressed his hand against the cold masonry beside him. He knew what he had to do. "We can't stay here," he whispered. Shaw opened his eyes. "Daniel, where are you going?" Daniel rose slowly, gripping Shaw's shoulder reassuringly. "I'm following their trail. If they took an officer last night, they'll move him before sunrise." Shaw's voice broke. "You can't, you're alone." Daniel paused at the doorway, looking back toward the young corporal lying helpless beneath the collapsed beams. "I've been alone before," he said quietly, "and I'm still here." He stepped outside. Snow fell harder now, swirling in tight spirals around the ruins. The distant rumble of tank engines drifted from deeper in the forest, the sound of reinforcements on the move. Daniel pulled his scarf tighter around his neck and walked into the cold. He didn't know where the officer had been taken. He didn't know how many Germans he would face. He didn't know if the cryptographic case was still intact, and he certainly didn't know if he had enough strength left for another fight. But he did know one thing with absolute clarity. He could not let the enemy escape with what they had taken. The snow swallowed his footprints as he disappeared into the trees, and the battle for Lignaville faded into silence, leaving behind nothing but destroyed tanks, shaken infantry, and the unsettling mystery of how many soldiers they believed they had faced. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of the courage ordinary soldiers carried into impossible moments, please share this video, like it to help it reach more people, and subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends. And before you go, tell us where in the world you're watching from. Your comments help keep these forgotten OES alive.